So my lesson today is tied to some events in the world and religious people's reaction to those events. On October 7th, the terrorist organization Hamas invaded Israel, attacked Israel, and there's been war going on back and forth over there since then. And maybe you've seen, I've seen, I've had friends bring up to me a lot of discussion in connection with that about biblical prophecy, about these things being signs of the coming end, of the return of the Lord. And people see various passages in the Bible and they interpret those in light of these current events and say, see, this prophecy is talking about this, and there was this attack, and Israel's involved. And so I want to share with you here some of the recent things that I've pulled off the internet in reaction to those physical earthly events and how people are doing that very thing. Prophecy update: Israel at war, on the brink of end times. Is Israel versus Hamas the start of World War III and the end times? Just a couple more things: Israel and Hamas and end times prophecy, and 2023 end time Bible prophecy, Israel war. Maybe you've heard people bringing this up and expressing concern or maybe even excitement in some people's cases that this is the sign of the end. This is the sign when the Lord is going to come back. In fact, this happens every time some new war breaks out, almost every time. People begin attaching significance to those things, saying, oh, this prophecy is talking about this that happened over in such and such a country. It especially happens if Israel is involved in the conflict. And one of the passages that people misinterpret this way is Matthew chapter 24. So I want us to look at Matthew chapter 24 today and see what we're talking about. Matthew chapter 24 is not the only passage that people appeal to in this way when they try to bring those Bible prophecies up to these current events. They'll also go to Daniel, Ezekiel, the book of Revelation. We don't have time to get into all of those things today, but we will take a look at Matthew 24. And included in Matthew 24 is a lesson that neither it nor any of those other things, like Daniel, Ezekiel, Revelation, are going to be signs of the end times. None of those things are. We see that when we see in Matthew chapter 24. I believe Matthew chapter 24 is, I don't want to go there just yet, is talking about two things. The first half of Matthew chapter 24, I believe, is talking about one thing. Second half of Matthew chapter 24, I believe, is talking about a different thing. I believe the first half of the chapter is talking about the Roman destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. That's a historical fact. Everybody knows the Romans came in, attacked Jerusalem, killed a lot of people, destroyed the temple. That's a fact, the Roman destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. And I believe Matthew chapter 24, as well as some other biblical passages, are prophecies about that coming event in the year 70, about 40 years after the crucifixion of Christ. I think the second half of chapter 24 is about the end times, but the big point that Jesus makes about the end times is there won't be any signs for it. You won't know when it's coming because there won't be any signs about it. So we'll take a look here, and I want to first of all notice the setting as this discussion begins in Matthew chapter 24. Let's read the first three verses here, and I'm going to pull up an image of the city of Jerusalem. In particular, that large complex you see is the temple courts. Is there a little laser pointer up here? If not, I don't really need it, but I just thought I would use it if there is one. Maybe this is one. Okay, so there's the wall around the whole temple complex. This is the wall around the temple courts, and this thing right there, that's the exact temple. right here you have the Valley of Kidron, and over here you have the Mount of Olives. The Mount of Olives is a little bit higher than the mount the temple is on, but you have this valley in between. So Matthew chapter 24, verse 1. And Jesus came out from the temple, and was going away when his disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to him. And he answered and said to them, do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here shall be left upon another, which will not be torn down. And as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming, and of the end of the age? So, verse 1, Jesus and his disciples are leaving the temple. I don't know if they've been in these outer courts or maybe even in this inner court, but they're leaving the temple, and they end up over here on the Mount of Olives in verse 3. So they're coming this way and crossing the valley and coming up onto the Mount of Olives. And as they go up the Mount of Olives, the disciples are turning around and pointing out the various buildings of the temple complex. They're beautiful buildings. And they're pointing these things out to him. And you know how we point out beautiful buildings. If you're Washington, D.C. or some city with great big tall architecture, you look at the buildings and you point them out. Oh, that's really nice. And, you do that. And they were doing this. And Jesus knows those buildings are about to crumble. Not the next day, but just short of 40 years in the future, the Romans would come in and destroy all those buildings. And so he tells them there in verse 2, do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here shall be left upon another, which will not be torn down. Well, as disciples, you're pointing out the beautiful buildings and somebody says, that's all going to be gone. When? That's what they're asking. He's just said it's going to be torn down. They ask when. Verse 3, tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Now I want to comment on this phrase, the end of the age. They've asked kind of three questions. One, when is that going to happen? When are all these stones going to be torn down? Two, what will be the sign of your coming? So we'll know that it's about to happen. And three, and of the end of the age. Now your translation may say the end of the world, it may say the end of the age. The Greek word that's used there can be translated either way. They've asked this in a way that probably didn't mean to be, but it's a little ambiguous whether they mean the end of this time period, the end of this age, or the end of the world. So those are and they may have thought that that was all the same question. When is the temple going to be torn down? And that's the end of the age, because it would be the end of the Jewish state with the temple worship and the sacrifices. It would be the end of all of that. And so it was the end of an age. So they may have been asking really one question there. But they do ask, when's it going to happen? What's the sign? So that we'll know. So let's work through chapter 24 here and see what Jesus responds to them. I forgot I have a couple more slides here, just showing what it looks like. If you look at, sorry, I'm so discoordinated this morning. If you look at this corner of the wall in this image, and then we go to a photograph of the land, that's this wall right here. Now, that's not the same wall from Jesus' day. The Romans tore it down, but it was rebuilt in the later centuries. This roughly is where the temple stood, but that is not the temple. It was destroyed in 70 AD and never rebuilt. That is what the Muslims have built there, the Dome of the Rock, a mosque there on that property. Islam views this property as holy ground as well because of Abraham's presence there, and they descended from Abraham through Ishmael. And so they consider this holy ground. They have control of the temple grounds and had built the dome of the rock there. This is, no, I don't want to end the show. A model of the city of Jerusalem that is in Jerusalem at one of the hotels there. It's obviously not life size. There's a sidewalk around it that you can walk around and view this. There's the temple. And this is a little bit like the view they would have had looking back, pointing out the buildings, except they wouldn't have been that high above as they look back at those buildings. But now, okay, as we go through Matthew chapter 24, we'll see two halves of the chapter. The first half, I believe, is about that destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. And Jesus talks in this half of the chapter about signs, how they'll know, how they'll be able to read the signs and know it's going to happen soon. Second half of the chapter, I believe, is about the final judgment, the end of time, the end of the world. And Jesus' emphasis in this part of the chapter is there will be no signs. That's a critically important difference in this chapter. First half, you'll have signs. Second half is obviously about something else because there will be no signs. Okay. So as we read, let's remember the question the disciples asked. After Jesus said those stones are going to be torn down, those buildings are going to be torn down, they asked, when will that be? And that's the question that Jesus begins to answer. Verse 4. And Jesus answered, said to them, see to it that no one misleads you, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will mislead many. And you'll be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. By the way, wars happen all the time. When has there been a time in history when there are no wars anywhere? And Jesus says, just because there's a war doesn't mean that that's it. And people today need to learn that same lesson. Just because there's a war doesn't mean that, some biblical prophecy is about to be fulfilled. Nation will rise against nation, verse 7, and kingdom against kingdom. And in various places there will be famines and earthquakes. But all these things are merely the beginnings of birth pains. Then they will deliver you to tribulation and will kill you. And you'll be hated by all nations on account of my name. Paul would be dead by the time this happened, for example. And Paul wasn't one of the disciples with Jesus on this occasion, but there was persecution of the Jews, specifically of the Christians, by the time we get to 70 AD. And I believe that's what Jesus is talking about. They'll deliver you to tribulation. They will kill you, and you'll be hated by all nations on account of my name. And at that time, many will fall away. That happened. Read about Paul talking about some who loved this present world and they didn't want to stand for what they believed to be true. At that time, many will fall away and will deliver up one another and hate one another, and false prophets rise and will mislead many. And because lawlessness is increased, most people's love will grow cold. That's true in a lot of parts of history. But people read verses like this and they immediately start thinking, this is talking about the end times. Well, hang on, because we're going to see by the time we get to the middle of the chapter that it's clearly not talking about the end times. Verse 13, but the one who endures to the end, not necessarily the end of the world, the end of the age, the one who endures to the end, he shall be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world for a witness to all the nations, and then the end shall come. I think that there's a few things in this chapter that I'm still unsure about, and I don't know exactly what the right explanation is, but I'll tell you what I think about this verse. That the gospel is to go forth from Jerusalem. Jesus talked about that. Biblical passages talk about that it would go forth from Jerusalem, because that was the heart of those who believed in God. And so the gospel would go out, as Jesus says, to the various kingdoms of the world, but then Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. I think that's what verse 15 is talking about. 15. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, Matthew adds in parentheses, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. There's a sign. Jesus says, this is when you'll know it's time to run. When you see the abomination of desolation that Daniel talked about. Now, what Daniel talked about when he mentioned the abomination of desolation was a historical event a couple of hundred years before Jesus, when Antiochus Epiphanes came, raided Jerusalem, went into the temple, sacrificed a pig on the altar there at the temple in Jerusalem. And you know, pigs, according to Mosaic law, were unclean animals. You would never, if you have any interest in God and his law for Israel, sacrifice a pig on the altar. That was an abomination. And it was an abomination connected to the temple being made desolate. So the abomination of desolation. And Jesus says here, when you see the abomination of desolation, then Matthew adds kind of in parentheses, let the reader understand. So I think we're to understand that Jesus isn't referring to that same exact event that had already happened a couple hundred years before Jesus, but to a similar event. When you see a similar abomination of desolation, when you see that, then let, verse 16, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. That emphasizes that this is a local judgment, local destruction of some kind, not a worldwide end of things, but something that you could escape simply by leaving Jerusalem, getting out of the city, getting away from leaving Judea. Verse 17, let him who is on the house not go down to get the things that are out in his house, and let him who is in the field not turn back to get his cloak. You know, you're working in the field. Fields were outside the city walls, and here comes the Romans, and you see something, that's like the abomination of desolation. I've got to run. But first, I want to go back into the city and get my cloak. Jesus says, no. When you see this, just run. This is a prophetic statement about events that were local to the situation there in and around Jerusalem. Verse 19, but woe to those who are with child and to those who nurse babes in those days. This is not Jesus saying, I'm going to punish you because you're pregnant. This is saying, you know, it's going to be trouble. It's going to be hard for women who are pregnant to get up quickly and run away out of the city. And so it's going to be trouble for them. Pray that your flight may not be in the winter or on a Sabbath. It's harder to travel in the winter weather. There's not much snow in Israel, but there is some. And he says, pray that your travel, pray this won't be on the Sabbath, because the Jews had established a rule about how far you could travel on the Sabbath, and it wasn't very far. And so, you know, he says, you don't have to deal with that. Verse 21, for then there will be a great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever shall. And unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days shall be cut short. So if the Romans came in and just continually crushed all people, even the saved, even the Christians, would die and suffer. But Jesus is saying that the days of attack are going to be cut short. You'll be able to get out of there. Then, verse 23, then if anyone says to you, behold, here is the Christ, or there he is, don't believe him. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and will show great signs and wonders, so as to mislead, if possible, even elect. Behold, I have told you in advance. He's told them in advance. He's warned them. He's talked about a sign that they'll have, that they'll know. And he says, I've told you in advance, not you. Jesus is talking to his disciples. He says, I've told you, because they're the ones who are going to be affected by this. Not people in the year 2023. You're going to have to start saying 2024 soon. But those people, the people he was talking about, therefore I've told you. Verse 26, if therefore they say to you, behold, he is in the wilderness, don't go forth, or behold, he is in the inner rooms, don't believe them. For just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be. When Jesus comes, in person, not bodily, but when he comes in judgment of Jerusalem, as God frequently came in judgment of Israel in the Old Testament, when he came and judged various other nations in the Old Testament period, he didn't come personally, but he brought an army. And here Jesus is saying that the Son of Man is going to come against Jerusalem. And everybody's going to know it when it happens. Verse 29, but immediately after the tribulation of those days, remember back in where was it? Verse 7, 8, somewhere there, he talked about there will be great tribulation. It says, but immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. All right. That does, on first reading, if you haven't studied a lot of the Old Testament prophecies, that sounds like something that, the astronomical events that we haven't seen so far. The moon won't give its light, the sun will be darkened, stars will fall from the sky. But if you know your Old Testament prophets, you know that this is common language that was used to describe when God allows one nation to attack another nation, and there's destruction, and there's the burning of cities, and kings fall from power. That's what's being talked about here. When a city burns, what ascends into the sky? Smoke. Smoke obscures the light of the moon and the sun. And you can see in the Old Testament prophets that that's what's being talked about when we read the phrases in times of judgment about the sun being darkened and the moon not shining its light. And also the stars falling from heaven. That was used in Old Testament prophecy to talk about rulers who've been high and powerful, and then they fall. So verse 29 is not talking about, the actual sun and the actual moon and actual stars falling from the sky, but those things that the Jews understood from their knowledge of the Old Testament. We're talking about attacks and destruction and burning and rulers falling from power. Now, don't blame someone if they look at me when I say that and say, but how do you know it means that? It might not mean that. Well, it's what that meant in the Old Testament, but I can still see someone being a little uncomfortable with that. But hang on just a minute till we get a few verses farther down. Verse 30, and then the sign of the Son of Man. Again, in this part of the chapter, we're seeing signs to recognize the time. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. That's a quotation from the Old Testament about another time of the Lord coming in judgment. This phrase, Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky, that's a quote from those previous prophecies about previous events. And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. Now, verse 32. Again, it's about signs so that they'll be able to recognize the time. Now, these couple of verses don't provide the sign, but it's Jesus saying, you know how to read signs, so you'll be able to recognize this. Verse 32. Now learn the parable from the fig tree. When the branch has already become tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. I don't have a fig tree in my yard, but at the front corner, the two front corners of my house, there's the same kind of tree. I'm not sure what kind of tree it is, but I know that it's the first thing to leaf out and blossom in the spring. That's the first thing that happens in my yard, except a few crocuses and daffodils, maybe. And when I see the buds on that tree, and I see those buds blooming in little flowers, I know, okay, we're finally about done with winter. Spring is arriving. That's what Jesus is saying about how they could read the fig tree. He says, you know how to read that. You know how to recognize signs. Verse 33, even so you too, when you see all these things, the things that he's been talking about, the thing that would be parallel to the abomination of desolation, these various signs that he's given them, even so you too, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near, right at the door. He's about to bring this judgment on Jerusalem. Verse 34, key verse. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. This generation. Now, some people read this verse and they say, oh, so it's going to happen in our generation. Now, Jesus is talking to some people in his day, and he tells them this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Okay. First half of the chapter, Jesus is, they're pointing out the temple buildings. He says it's all going to be destroyed. They ask when. When's it going to be destroyed? That's what Jesus answers. And he tells them, there's going to be this sign and that sign. And don't believe some of these other things. Don't interpret them as signs, but I am giving you some signs. And you're able to read signs. You can do it with a fig tree, so you can do it with these things I'm telling you. And this generation won't pass away until all of it happens. That's the first half of Matthew chapter 24. Now, I haven't looked in my notes for a little bit here. Let me see where I am. Okay, so that is not talking about, at least the first half of the chapter is not talking about the end of time, the end of the world. It's talking the local destruction of the temple and Jerusalem and of a number of people. And so Jesus says, those of you who trust in me, you need to get out of the city when you see these signs and see this about to happen. Is that really going to happen? Someone might wonder. Maybe some of the disciples might wonder, really? I mean, the temple, that's the temple of God. And it's really going to be destroyed? And it's going to happen in our generation, they think, that as they're thinking this through. And so Jesus wants to emphasize how absolutely sure, solid his statements are about this. And he compares something that is very sure and solid, but is still going to, at some point, be done away with. But he says, my words are even more sure than that. They will never fail. What's something really sure and solid and stable? The earth. Skies, the heavens. That's pretty sure and solid and stable, right? All kinds of things have happened through known history, but the earth is still here, still spinning around. Jesus says in verse 34, truly I say to you, verse 35, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words shall never pass away. As sure and solid as the earth and the heavens are, even they're going to pass away. But my words, Jesus says, are more stable and sure and solid than that. They will never pass away. So, what Jesus has said in this first half of Matthew chapter 24, it's going to happen. It's going to happen, and they'll see signs that they can recognize the time is near. It's going to happen in their generation, and what they need to do out of Jerusalem when they see those signs. But there's a shift somewhere here in Matthew where Jesus starts talking about some different things. If you look, how many of you have red letter Bibles with the words of Jesus in red? A number of you do. That'll be handy here. If you look through the end of chapter 24 and through the end of chapter 25, it's Jesus continuing his message. It's him continuing to speak to his disciples. And you get to the end of chapter 25, And it's this passage where Jesus says, the king will, Matthew chapter 25, verse 31 and 32, but when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne, and all the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate them from one another, as the shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. This is the passage where he says, I was hungry and you fed me, I was in prison and you came to me, and they asked, when did we see you? And he says, well, when you did it to these who are mine, it was like doing it to me. And then he'll turn to the goats on his left, and they'll say, I was in prison and you didn't come to me. I was hungry and you gave me nothing. They're like, we would have helped you. He says, yeah, but you didn't help these that are mine. And so at the end of the chapter, he'll answer them saying, truly I say to you, to the extent that you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. So what event is he talking about here? That's the end of time. That's the final judgment. So somewhere between the beginning of 24 and the end of 25, he has shifted from that destruction of Jerusalem to talking about the end of time. Where does that shift happen? I believe it happens right here in the middle of Matthew chapter 24, right where we are, when he is introduced to the thought about heaven and earth, that as sure and stable as they are, there's going to be a time when they are destroyed, when they fail. He brought that up to draw a contrast between heaven and earth and his word, which will never fail, but he's brought it up. He's brought up the idea of the end of the world, the end of heaven and earth. So as he says in verse 35, we've already read, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words shall not pass away. But of that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. So I think he's brought up the destruction of heaven and earth just to contrast that even that will fail, but his word won't. But now he's brought up the idea of the end of the world. And he says, but of that day and hour, when heaven and earth be destroyed, no one knows. And as we'll see in the verses that follow, his message is going to be, there won't be any signs for that judgment. We're not going to be, you and I aren't going to be walking around and suddenly realize, oh, this event that's happening, that's a sign that Jesus is about to come back. No, the message in this part of the chapter is that there won't be any signs. So verse 35, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words shall not pass away. But of that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. For the coming of the Son of Man will be just like in the days of Noah. For as in those days, which were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, they were marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark, and they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away. So shall the coming of the Son of Man be. Now Noah, presumably, had been telling them that this is going to happen, but they didn't know when. And then one day it starts raining, and maybe if they're nearby, they hear the door of the ark slamming shut, and it's too late. There were no signs to say when that was going to happen. And Jesus says, when I come again, when heaven and earth are destroyed, it'll be like in the days of Noah, just going about living your life, and suddenly there it is, no signs to know it was about to happen. Verse 40, then there shall be 2 men in the field, one will be taken and one will be left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and one will be left. Therefore be on the alert, for you do not know which day yours is coming. First half of the chapter, there were signs, you'd be able to read those signs, and that's when get out of the city. Second half of the chapter, it's about something different, the end of the world. For you do not know which day your Lord is coming. Verse 43, an illustration. But be sure of this, that if the head of the house had known at what time of night the thief was coming, he would have been on the alert and would not have allowed his house to be broken into. For this reason, you be ready too, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour when you do not think he will. My house was broken into several years ago. I never locked my doors, so maybe I can't say that it was broken into. And maybe that's why it happened. But I lost two things that were really important to me. Somebody came in and stole them. If I had known that that was about to happen, if there'd been some sign that, a thief is going to come today, I would have stayed home. I would have maybe called the cops. When are they coming? I'm not sure. I just know they're coming today. I don't know how I would have handled that. I would have at least locked the doors before I left the house. But I didn't know that the thief was going to come today. Jesus is saying with this that he's talking about now, I believe is the end of the world, the final judgment, it'll be like that. So just be ready. I wasn't ready in regard to my house, but in regard to our souls, we need to be ready. Verse 45, a lesson, an illustration about being ready all the time, about always doing what you should be doing. Verse 45, who then is the faithful and sensible slave whom his master put in charge of his household to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is that slave whom his master finds so doing when he comes. Because the slave doesn't know when his master is going to come back. He just knows I've got this responsibility. He's been doing it all the time. Blessed is that slave whom his master finds so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you, that he will put him in charge of all his possessions. But if that evil slave says in his heart, my master is not coming for a long time. If I had said, oh, there won't be a thief coming into my house, it won't happen to me. And if that slave begins to beat his fellow slaves and eat and drink with drunkards, the master of that slave will come on a day when he does not expect, and at an hour which he does not know, and shall cut him in pieces and assign him a place with the hypocrites. Weeping shall be there, and the gnashing. It's talking about the end of time, the end of the world. And the message is there won't be some sign to let you know, oh, I better get my life in order. I better start living the way I should be living. Better start fulfilling my responsibility. There won't be a sign for that. The master expects us to be doing our job all the time. And he's going to come in a moment when we don't. And that will be the end of the world. So we look at the attack in October into Israel and the war that has been going the other direction since then into Gaza. And people want to see that as a sign of the end times. But when Jesus talks about signs in Matthew chapter 24, he's talking about one event, the destruction of Jerusalem. And when he begins to talk about the end of the world, the end times, he says, you won't know. There won't be any signs for that. No one knows, only the Father alone. You just need to be ready all the time because you won't know when it's going to happen. The war in Israel, other wars that we see from time to time, they're terrible and I hate them. But they're not signs of the end times. God wanted to give us signs of the end times. So we have not looked at Ezekiel and Daniel and Revelation. We've only looked at one of the passages that people take and say, these are signs of the end times. So we haven't addressed the arguments from those other books of the Bible. But this book, these words of Jesus include a statement that's important for all of those. There won't be signs. So any person who pulls from Ezekiel or Daniel or Revelation something that he believes are signs of the times, Jesus says no. There won't be any signs, not from any book of the Bible. You won't know when he's going to come again. And the lesson from that, as he mentioned there at the end of chapter 24, as he mentions in chapter 25, with the virgins who had their oil for their lamps and the virgins who didn't have the oil for their lamps because they had not prepared. And as he talks about the talents and who used their talents and who didn't, the lesson of that is be ready all the time. And if you're ready today, I don't know when the Lord's going to come back. It could be today, could be next week, be 1,000 years from now. But we need to be ready all the time. And not just out of fear of punishment, but out of love for our God, who created us, who gives us every good thing we have. It's because God has made this world in a way that gives us good things. A God who seeks to bless us, who seeks to encourage us to be moral people, to care about our neighbor, to live well and right. We ought to want to serve him. And that's why we study all the time, is because we want to be good all the time. We want to thank him all the time and live for him. If you have some need before us this morning, would you come as we stand and sing?